A woman was about to withdraw money to buy ice cream for her daughter. While entering her PIN, the bakery next door suddenly exploded. No one could have expected that the blast would uncover an underground palace, but the discovery of this ancient structure triggered a butterfly effect with unimaginable consequences. Edward, a mathematical prodigy at Cambridge University, was so obsessed with math that people considered him a freak. His mentor, Professor Robert, often struggled to deal with him. Following his wife Andrea's advice, Robert invited Edward to their home. At first, in a cordial atmosphere, Robert intended to persuade Edward not to be so stubborn, but to his surprise, Andrea started talking math with him right at the dinner table. As the conversation grew lively, Andrea pulled out some photos and handed them to Edward. They were images of ancient ruins uncovered in the Baghdad explosion. One picture, showing the ceiling of the palace, immediately caught Edward's eye. He noticed a numerical pattern inscribed on it. Without hesitation, he grabbed a pen and began scribbling equations all over the tablecloth. Within moments, it was filled with dense mathematical formulas, but before he could finish, there was no more space left. Edward asked to return to his dorm to continue. Robert deliberately kept the tablecloth. You can see why he makes me uncomfortable. That passion, that purity, it's so much like hers. Angrily, Robert took the tablecloth into his study, pulled out his notebook, and continued the calculations following Edward's reasoning, completely unaware that a pair of eyes was watching him from the shadows. The next day, Edward shared his research project with Robert, the hidden connection between prime numbers and the universe. He believed the wonders of nature were linked to primes. An apple has 5 seed chambers, most flowers have 3, 5, or 13 petals, humans have 23 pairs of chromosomes, and certain insects require 17 seasons to grow into a swarm. Meanwhile, human society was built on non-primes because they seemed easier to control. But since not everything can be controlled, Edward believed the true laws of the universe lay hidden in prime numbers. He placed the photos Andrea had given him on the table. After a night of reasoning, he concluded they were a kind of formula for the existence of prime numbers. If scholars more than 900 years ago had studied it, then he wanted to continue the path, but Robert immediately rejected the idea. Sorry, but I advise you to stop this. You must stop right now. What followed, however, was even more shocking to Edward. All the research documents he frequently consulted in the library were erased. The results he had stored in his dorm were stolen. From the dorm manager, Edward learned the culprit was none other than Robert. Furious, Edward banged on Robert's office door, but the professor had already left campus. Determined, Edward went to Robert's home and knocked persistently until Andrea answered. She said Robert wasn't there but had left a message. I still wanted to say goodbye to you, but it was truly difficult. Sorry I couldn't give you more. Please be happy. It wasn't because of anything you did. What they didn't know was that Robert was already dead in his car, having stolen Edward's research documents before his death. While drowning in despair, Edward discovered a letter tucked inside a cabinet. Opening it, he found no words, only a hand-drawn dodecahedron. Seizing the moment when no one was around, Edward slipped into Robert's office. After searching for a while without success, he noticed the trash bin. Sure enough, he found his notebook inside, but its valuable contents had been burned to ashes. Furious, Edward wrecked the office, the noise drawing the attention of the manager and campus security. As Cambridge's brightest mathematical genius, Edward was offered a chance by the school council. Withdraw his accusation against Robert before the police got involved and write a public apology letter. But Edward only cared about Robert stealing and destroying his research. He was determined to uncover the truth. Will you apologize? No. Because of his stubbornness, Edward was forced to leave Cambridge. With no support left, he rented a tiny apartment just a few square meters nearby. Sanders, an external operative for the U.S. National Security Agency, was tasked with monitoring 15 of Europe's top mathematicians. Professor Robert was one of them. Edward's earlier actions at Robert's house had caught her attention, but since her main target was Robert, she didn't pay much attention to Edward. What is he doing with that tablecloth? I'm not sure. He looks terrified. Reviewing the surveillance footage from previous days, Sanders noticed something suspicious. After burning his notebook in his office, Robert drove to an underground parking lot. Once the garage door shut, white smoke seeped out. Realizing something was wrong, Sanders immediately reported it to her superior, Olson. Meanwhile, Edward sought out Osborne, Cambridge's most respected mathematics professor, who had retired and was battling Alzheimer's. Edward still believed only Osborne could help him. He showed him the letter Robert had left, asking why it depicted a dodecahedron. Osborne seemed to recall something and retrieved a book from his shelf. It told of Pythagoras, the father of Western numerology, and his student Hippasus, who had successfully drawn a dodecahedron. The ancient Greeks believed it was the shape of the universe, something only the gods could create. Hippasus's act was seen as elevating himself to the level of the gods. Pythagoras killed him because this knowledge was forbidden. While comparing the drawings, Edward noticed a watermark on the letter. Following this clue, he visited Andrea, who revealed that after Edward had scribbled equations on the tablecloth, Robert had become extremely agitated. The next day, he burned the tablecloth. Soon after Edward's research was stolen, Andrea didn't know the meaning of Robert's letter, but she too wanted answers. Later, Edward went to Robert's office. On a payment receipt, he saw a logo identical to the watermark, belonging to a research institute called Kepler. A photo on the wall caught his attention. Robert had once mentioned that someone else had worked on a similar project. Andrea told him the person was named Sophia, but refused to elaborate. Leaving Andrea's house, Edward returned to campus. Using Osborne's name, he retrieved Sophia's notes from the archives. The contents seemed ordinary, but in the corner of the manuscript, he found the same dodecahedron symbol. That night, a man claiming to be from the Kepler Institute came to Edward's door. Although Edward didn't know what Kepler really did, his instincts told him his research and Robert's death were tied to the organization. Elsewhere, Sanders received the official report. Robert's cause of death was carbon monoxide poisoning, a suicide, but upon reviewing the surveillance footage, she discovered it had been deliberately altered. The supposed suicide note was also a fake, its voice generated by artificial intelligence. When she confirmed this, Sanders reported it again, but the final order was clear: stop the surveillance. She was convinced things were far from simple. The methods used pointed to highly skilled killers. Olson, wanting no further trouble, urged Sanders to drop the matter. Sanders, don't. Before he could finish, Olson's head was blown apart. Horrified, Sanders fled as the assassin pursued her, firing shots that narrowly missed. With no escape, she leapt into the sea, unaware a sniper was already waiting for her to surface. Meanwhile, Edward remained baffled by Sophia's manuscript. Too many questions lingered, so he returned to Osborne for answers. But just as he stepped outside, agents from Kepler intercepted him. The institute seemed to know everything about Cambridge's mathematics elite. Robert was dead, Osborne was afflicted with Alzheimer's, and both were deeply connected to Kepler. Kepler is a private research institute. We cultivate extraordinary individuals. We make this world a better place. Later, Edward visited Osborne again. He couldn't believe a scholar like Sophia would make so many basic mistakes. In her draft, all the correct answers were crossed out and replaced with wrong numbers, as if done intentionally. Then ask her yourself. Sophia died a long time ago. She took her own life. No, this is horrifying. That night, on his way home, Edward realized someone was tailing him. He quickly turned into an alley, only to find another figure blocking his path. Alarmed, Edward pedaled faster, but the masked pursuers soon caught up. They shoved him to the ground, snatched his backpack, and fled. Edward slowly got up. Instead of chasing them, he rode straight home, unaware that a mysterious woman was now following him from a distance. The next day, Edward stopped by a bar and ordered a beer. When he returned to his table, a young woman was sitting nearby. What unsettled him was that she not only knew his name but also knew he'd been robbed the night before. What was stolen wasn't money or a phone, it was his research. Who are you? The people chasing you are the same ones who came after me. They already tried to kill me. They're not playing games. Until I figure out what's going on, you're my only lead. Although Sanders didn't know what Edward was working on, she knew someone placed great value on his research. From Edward, she learned that what had been stolen was Sophia's manuscript. Even though the document was gone, Edward remembered it perfectly. What he couldn't understand was why anyone cared about a seemingly random string of numbers. Sanders then reminded him, a number doesn't always have to be about mathematics. Her words sparked a realization. Together, they went to the university library. When Edward entered the sequence into the search system, a book popped up. They rushed upstairs, and after a frantic search, Sanders found it. Edward flipped through the pages carefully but found no notes or markings. Sanders asked to look, but Edward refused. With no choice, Sanders revealed her true identity as an NSA operative. Taking the book from Edward, she examined it thoroughly and discovered several pages hidden in the cover. Edward immediately recognized Sophia's handwriting, but just as they were about to read them, the library's alarm blared. Sensing danger, Sanders pulled Edward toward the stairs, but when she spotted the assassins inside, she yanked him back. They darted deeper into the library, splitting up between the shelves to confuse their pursuers. As Edward backed away, one of the assassins crept up behind him, choking him before slamming him into a bookcase. At that moment, Sanders rushed in, taking the man down with a few swift strikes. They seized the chance, sprinted to the emergency exit, smashed the glass, and bolted outside. Breathless, they only stopped when they reached a nearby cathedral. There, Sanders revealed her mission, monitoring Europe's mathematicians. She wanted to know what Robert had burned before his death, and she insisted he had been murdered. Her superior had also been killed because of this case. Having barely escaped herself, she sought out Edward to uncover the truth. Edward explained that his research focused on finding patterns in prime numbers, ironically, the very foundation of digital security. If one could uncover the laws of randomness, any password could be cracked, bank accounts, government files, even defense systems, yet his work remained purely theoretical, not practically feasible. They recalled Sophia's letter. It contained a summary of her thesis and a plea to bring it to light. Enclosed was half of a flyer with the Kapler Institute logo. Could her death be tied to this shadowy organization? Kapler was known for sponsoring brilliant mathematicians, but entry was no easy feat. Candidates had to provide biometric data and undergo rigorous testing. As one of Cambridge's rare prodigies, Edward was accepted without issue. But he wasn't there for funding. He wanted answers about Sophia's and Robert's deaths, and the research that disappeared with them. A few days earlier, Sanders had persuaded Edward to infiltrate the Kapler Institute to recover Sophia's missing research, but Edward feared he'd end up like Robert, murdered with the scene staged as a suicide. Still, whether he liked it or not, Kapler already had its eyes on him. You don't have a choice. I know you're scared, but you must go to Kapler. It's the only way we'll uncover who's really behind this. Listen, I won't let anything happen to you. That's just a theory. Determined to find the truth, Edward finally agreed to enter the institute. His first task was to check their database, but Sophia's name was nowhere to be found, only Robert's. Since 1994, Robert had been registered with Kapler. Yet all his projects and progress were marked classified. For 3 decades, the institute had continued funding him. At that time, Robert and Sophia had been lovers, but the very year Robert joined Kapler, Sophia took her own life, and her research disappeared without a trace. Edward suspected those files must still be hidden within Kapler's system. Find a way to get them. If they covered it up 30 years ago, then what we need is definitely there. But how? The next day, Edward returned to Kapler. A formula etched on a glass wall immediately caught his attention. It was clearly number theory. A woman approached and admitted she had written it weeks ago. She had once been a mathematician, too, until Kapler convinced her to stop. Why? Let's just say I'm content with their funding. Meanwhile, Sanders phoned Jane, the NSA branch director in France, reporting her findings and her intent to investigate Kapler. But Jane dismissed her, claiming Sanders's current condition made her unfit for duty, and ordered her back to headquarters. Before Jane could finish, Sanders hung up. The following day, she saved her number in Edward's phone and instructed him to call once inside the institute, ready to steal the data. Edward then recalled the archaeological photos Andrea had given him. The ancient formulas depicted they're all related to prime numbers. He believed Robert's death, Sophia's work, and even his own research were tied to what was known as the Palace of Wisdom. Convinced the key lay there, he agreed, but first, they needed to complete their mission. Sanders handed him a USB stick. Once plugged into a terminal, she could remotely crack the database. That night, Edward returned to Kapler. When a female staffer was about to leave, he struck up a conversation. On her desk lay her ID badge. One glance, and Edward memorized her login details. At midnight, with the institute empty, Edward called Sanders. Using the credentials he'd memorized, he logged into the database and inserted the USB. With Sanders's help, he uncovered hidden files, but when he tried to open a folder titled Prime Numbers, an error appeared. Access locked. It was clear something valuable was inside. Sanders tried repeatedly to break in but failed. When Edward mentioned the operating system was Axie, Sanders froze. Axie was a proprietary OS developed by a private security firm for the US government, virtually unbreakable. Fortunately, Sanders was familiar with it. At last, the folder opened. Edward saw a list of researchers, including Sophia. Clicking on her profile, he discovered she and Robert had signed their contracts with Kapler the same year. Yet all her research files were marked deleted. He clicked another tab. This time, the screen filled with surveillance videos of Sophia, sending screenshots to Sanders. She instantly recognized them. It was the very project she'd been assigned, monitoring Europe's top mathematicians. What baffled her was how Kapler had obtained the data. Even more shocking, Edward found his own name on the list. When he opened it, he saw surveillance footage of himself. Just then, the manager suddenly appeared. Though Edward quickly shut the browser, the woman still sensed something wrong. As soon as she stepped out, Sanders urged him, "Take the USB and get out of the institute now." Edward yanked it out, grabbed his backpack, and slipped away. Seconds before the manager and guards arrived, he was already on his bike, escaping Kapler. Back home, Edward and Sanders smashed every hidden camera, packed their belongings, and fled. On the way to the airport, Sanders reported to Jane, "There's a mole leaking data from the surveillance project." Their next destination, Baghdad, the ancient ruins. There could be the key to everything, but Sanders didn't know Jane was already in contact with someone else. "We've got a problem. Her investigative skills are better than I expected." Sanders knows there's a mole. When Edward and Sanders landed in Baghdad, they were immediately tailed. Edward called Andrea, Robert's widow, who was working at the dig site. He wanted to study the mysterious mathematical formulas unearthed there. But when they met, Edward froze, unsure how to speak. Sanders broke the silence. Robert had not killed himself. Do you have any proof of that? Edward then revealed Sanders's identity as an NSA operative tasked with monitoring Europe's top mathematicians. They believed Robert's death was tied to the formulas in the ruins. If they could get inside, they might uncover the truth and the mastermind. But when Andrea learned she and her husband had been under surveillance for years, she refused. The conversation ended bitterly. Elsewhere, the NSA received an order: eliminate Edward. Agents in Baghdad awaited Jane's approval. Fine, I'll handle it. Yet Jane didn't want Sanders harmed. She had recruited her, trained her, and raised her into a top agent. Jane called, urging Sanders to give Edward some space, a cover to keep her away from the hit. But just then, Edward appeared. Sanders cut the call. Damn it. The scene shifted. Edward approached the ruins alone. Andrea spotted him and led him to a nearby market. As they strolled, unaware of their stalkers, an agent requested clearance to strike. With Sanders absent, Jane gave the green light. Take out the target. The assassin drew a dagger, closing in on Edward. By chance, Sanders was also at the market. The glint of the blade immediately put her on edge. She sprinted, shouting Edward's name, but the noise drowned her out. Just as the assassin lunged, a shadow burst from the crowd, slamming him to the ground. Static filled Jane's earpiece. On site, the mysterious man, a dig site security guard, dragged the assassin into a warehouse. A brutal fight broke out. In the end, the weaker assassin was choked to death. When Sanders arrived, she caught only the guard's silhouette fleeing. Checking the fallen agent, she confirmed he was dead. Meanwhile, Jane kept calling through the headset. Alarmed, Sanders grabbed the earpiece. A familiar voice crackled through. Is Edward dead yet? Panicked for his safety, Sanders rushed back toward the ruins. She soon spotted the guard again, snapped a photo, and sent it through NSA's facial recognition system. The result came fast. He was a Serbian mercenary, not one of theirs, but not an enemy to Edward either. With that assurance, Sanders left the scene. Soon after, Jane received word of the agent's death. Whoever had killed him, one thing was clear: the people tracking Edward weren't just Americans. Pulling out now would mean losing everything. Since she couldn't stop it, Jane resolved to control it, and Sanders was the perfect tool to exploit. Meanwhile, Andrea returned to her hotel. At her door, a strange man shoved her against the wall and thrust a folder into her hands. It was a report on the explosion at the ruins. Terrified, the man warned her never to trust anyone at the excavation site before fleeing. Suspicious, Andrea showed the report to Sanders. It revealed the ruins had not emerged by chance. They had been deliberately exposed with explosives planted long before. Sanders urged her to act as if nothing had happened and continue working with Edward. Digging deeper, Sanders discovered that Dr. Nazar, the excavation's lead archaeologist, was also from Cambridge. An odd coincidence. At the site, Andrea uncovered a French silver coin, evidence someone had studied the ruins long ago. On a wall, she also found embossed markings where letters had once been carved. This clue led her to archival prints from the 17th century stored at the University of Orléans in France. Sanders told Edward and Andrea the ruins were no longer safe. She urged them to return to Paris, then head to Orléans to search for the missing piece, something that could decode prime numbers and give them leverage. Andrea, however, refused to leave. Before parting, she handed Edward her ancient text translations, asking him to uncover Robert's killer. Elsewhere, Jane reviewed surveillance footage of the slain agent and investigated the mercenary's identity. Afterward, she phoned Sanders, claiming to have prepared plane tickets to France. But Sanders had already guessed Jane was behind everything. Have you found his body yet? What? I'm sorry about what happened to him. Hanging up, Jane replayed the footage until Sanders herself appeared, proof the cover-up was blown. Edward and Sanders returned to Paris, but their true destination was Orléans. To avoid detection, Sanders bought a used motorcycle. NSA soon traced her phone signal and dispatched agents to capture them. But when the team cornered their supposed targets in an alley, they discovered they had been tricked. Their captives were only the shop owner and his assistant, carrying Sanders's phone. 2 hours later, Edward and Sanders arrived at the University of Orléans. They sought access to the 17th century prints. Though not open to the public, Edward's sincerity convinced the curator to let them view the collection. He searched for the missing fragment, but none of the pieces matched. Just then, an announcement signaled closing time, forcing them to return the next day. But when they came back, the artifacts were gone, already checked out. As they puzzled over this, a familiar face emerged, the mercenary who had killed the U.S. agent in Baghdad. He was the one who had taken the artifacts. From the rooftop, Sanders and Edward watched as crates were loaded into an armored truck. Running the plates, Sanders learned they were bound for England. Under the supervision of mercenary Bogdan, the pair followed the convoy to the Eurotunnel terminal, plotting to stage chaos during the crossing and seize the artifacts aboard. Jane learned that Bogdan was heading for England. Certain Sanders would be on the train. She ordered all resources mobilized to monitor the situation. Then she called Edward. Since Sanders had no phone, he was her only way to reach her. Sanders answered but no longer trusted Jane. From her tone, she knew she was being watched. Sure enough, a surveillance camera was staring from the wall. Hanging up, Sanders hacked into the train system and shut down every camera. Before the train entered the Channel Tunnel, she made a coded call to a mysterious number, reporting an emergency on board. Moments later, the lights went out. When they came back, an announcement declared the train had a malfunction. Rescue vehicles would arrive in 11 minutes. As passengers were evacuated, Edward and Sanders hid behind a truck. Once Bogdan followed the crowd into another tunnel, they dashed out. Sanders jammed a hacking device into the armored truck's lock. Meanwhile, guards swept the train, believing there was a bomb. With only 7 minutes left, Sanders told Edward to crawl under the truck. A guard spotted Sanders and closed in just as the lock clicked open. She pretended to be retrieving her belongings but was denied and escorted away. In that instant, she yanked her tool free. Edward crawled out, slipped inside the truck, and began searching for the missing artifact. Bogdan soon doubled back, but Edward leapt out the front as the mercenary flung open the rear door. A frantic chase erupted through the tunnel. Edward reached the rescue zone just as the connecting doors began to close. Sanders sealed them remotely, and Edward squeezed in at the last second. Bogdan was left behind, furious. But now Edward doubted Sanders. He realized the assassin in Baghdad had been sent by the NSA. Forced to confess, Sanders admitted the truth. They argued bitterly, their trust shattered, and parted ways. Edward boarded a rescue bus, still under surveillance. Keep eyes on him, he has unfinished business. Sanders boarded another bus. A man sat down beside her, pulling out a phone. Looks like I'm the one left to clean up your mess. Fine, let's talk. The Cambridge prodigy, hunted for his pursuit of knowledge, had finally fallen into NSA's hands, this time, betrayed by his own lover, an undercover agent. Edward awoke groggy from sedatives, hallucinating glowing particles swirling in his hands, as if glimpsing the secrets of the universe. But then the lights snapped on. NSA Deputy Director Andrew entered with his men, their intent clear: force Edward to continue his research. They handed him Sophia's thesis, demanding he unlock the key to crack every digital system. Meanwhile, Sanders was taken to the same facility, face to face with her foster mother, Jane. So, will you hear me out? Only if you're telling the truth. At last, Jane revealed everything. Their unit, long hidden under the guise of a U.S. government branch, was in fact controlled by a private company called Axiorn. Unbound by any restrictions, the private company Axiorn could do what governments could not. The shadowy Kapler Institute was one of their projects. They also funded Robert and Sophia, two Cambridge mathematicians who were killed simply because they abandoned their research on prime numbers. So Edward is building you a tool to crack the code of prime numbers. And what happens after that? What will you do with it? Nothing. Don't brush me off. I'm serious. Owning and using it are two different things. You want control. Yes, we can protect everyone. This is our survival. Meanwhile, Edward had begun his project, scrawling equations across his walls, only to hit a dead end. When Sanders discovered he was in the same facility, she shifted sides, agreeing to work with Jane on one condition: once Edward finished, he had to be released. The next day, as Edward stared at the formulas, the door opened. To his shock, Professor Osborne walked in. Edward couldn't accept that NSA had dragged an old man with Alzheimer's into this mess. Furious, he tried to erase his work, but Osborne stopped him. Despite his illness, Osborne's passion for math hadn't faded. After reviewing Edward's equations, he picked up a marker and added to the wall. Combined with Robert's earlier drawings, the two men worked side by side until the solution emerged. The answer was always there, waiting to be found. This is your moment. Then Sanders entered. Taking Edward's notebook, she began coding under Jane's watchful eye. Try after try, nothing worked. Maybe he's lying to us. Or maybe you are. Let's hear it from the genius himself. Escorted by Andrew, Sanders confronted Edward, demanding he correct the results. This is the last time. Fine, I'll fix it. Edward took back his notebook. Sanders turned to Jane, standing at the glass. Jane, this one's for you. What? She keyed a command into her phone. The lights cut out, alarms blared, and in the chaos Sanders attacked Andrew, knocking him down. Edward wiped the formulas from the walls as Sanders flung the doors open. They fled, Andrew smashing through after them with a fire extinguisher and gun in hand. One shot rang out. Osborne collapsed, dead. Before Andrew could fire again, Sanders struck from behind, knocking him unconscious. Grabbing his gun, she dragged Edward into the night. They ran until he collapsed from exhaustion. Now free of NSA's grasp, Sanders used Edward's formulas to hack their system, erasing every trace of the research. The world-ending weapon existed only on her phone. At Kepler, Jane anticipated Sanders's next move and made preparations. Meanwhile, Fiona received a coded message from Edward. She met with a librarian and secretly stole his dorm key. When Edward and Sanders returned, she had food waiting. Sanders swept the place for danger before locking her gun in a drawer. But Edward was broken. Osborne's death weighed on him. If not for his obsession, none of this would have happened. Tired of running, he made a choice. I want to fight back. At that moment, Fiona suddenly appeared, the only friend Edward could trust at Cambridge. Not wanting to drag her into danger, he told her to stay away. But as she turned to leave, Sanders stopped her. A plan had struck. They could use the university's computers to infiltrate Kepler. Working together, Sanders broke into the library system and, through her phone, hacked Kepler's internal network. Meanwhile, Edward refused to sit idle. He burned his notebook, then deliberately appeared on surveillance cameras. As expected, NSA agents rushed in, but Edward slipped away. At the same time, Sanders crippled Kepler's security grid, breaching their encrypted vaults. Jane could only watch as sensitive files were stolen. By the time she traced Sanders's location, the data transfer was complete. On her monitor, Sanders's message appeared with a photo stamped, "Traitor Agent." Then came a set of coordinates. Following the trail, Jane confronted Sanders in a wheat field. The foster daughter she once raised had destroyed her career. Sanders had already transmitted everything to the Department of Defense. For Jane, prison was inevitable. Elsewhere, Edward visited Andrea at Robert's home, recounting all that had happened. They're Axiorn, a private security company. Mercenaries for the banks. Prime numbers, that's what they fear. If exposed, they lose everything. Robert had died to protect Edward. Guilt weighed heavily. If only he had listened. Just then, Andrea received a call from Headmaster James. Police were hunting Edward and had reached the university. James urged Andrea to bring him in. She escorted Edward to James's office, but the headmaster dismissed her, insisting on speaking privately. Andrea grew suspicious. Meanwhile, Sanders returned to Edward's dorm, finding his burned notebook and the missing gun. Alarmed, she rang Andrea, but Andrea had already crossed paths with Dr. Nazar, who had come to enroll his daughter on a full scholarship, something only James had the power to arrange. Andrea and Sanders realized the truth. James was the real threat. Once a renowned mathematician, he had invented public key encryption, initially to protect people, but ultimately used to cover government crimes. Edward's work could patch its flaws. James intended to unleash it, expose every secret, plunge the world into chaos, and reap the rewards. He had ordered Nazar to trigger the explosion in Baghdad and manipulate Andrea to open the ruins. Edward was just another pawn. If he refused, there were plenty more geniuses at Cambridge. You won't stop, will you? No. Edward raised the gun and fired. James collapsed, dead. Moments later, Sanders and Andrea rushed in. Andrea handed Sanders her car keys, telling her to get Edward out. Driving into the night, Sanders knew someone had to take the fall, but the weapon that could end the world could not fall into the wrong hands. She handed Edward the phone. From afar, sirens blared. Reluctantly, Edward took the device and fled. Sanders was taken by police. Soon after, NSA launched a probe into the leak. Several top officials were purged. The man leading the investigation, none other than Andrew, the traitor. In the crowd, Edward quietly pulled the phone from his pocket. After a long hesitation, he made his choice. He opened Pandora's box. That concludes the film Prime Target. What did you think of it? On a scale of 1 to 10, how would you rate it? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.